Hello, and welcome to Crusading History, discussing the latest research into the Crusades, Crusading, and the Crusaded. This is part two of my interview with Dr. Fadi Ragheb on Mamluk period Faḍā'i'l al-Quds literature and its relevance for the history of the Crusades. If you haven't watched part one yet, please feel free to do so. The link is in the description box below. But for now, let's move straight into the interview. Okay, so you've mentioned that the Faḍā'i'l texts don't just praise Jerusalem, but describe its topography and its religious topography particularly. What do these descriptions suggest about how medieval Muslims understood sacred space?
Well, one of the major issues of why a space would become sacred is I think it's in its association with the foundation of the faith, its association with the Prophet Muhammad, and with its association with his companions and with the early generation of Muslims, at-Tabi'un. So one of the most defining features of Jerusalem that makes it sanctified within the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds and within the Islamic faith is we know that it served as the first Qibla, the first direction of prayer for the Prophet while he was in Mecca. We also know that Jerusalem was the destination for Prophet Muhammad's nocturnal journey, the night journey, al-Isra, uh, and where he flew or in his dream. I mean, there's a whole debate about it, but Jerusalem was the destination of al-Isra night journey, where he prayed with prophets there. Another way Jerusalem is also sanctified, including these individual holy sites, is their association with biblical figures and pious figures from the past. So you have Jerusalem as a city that, as we all know, is quite associated with biblical narratives from its foundation with David and Solomon all the way to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And later the role of the city within the Christian faith and the saints of the religion of Christianity. So those are elements that makes things or places or holy sites or regions and cities sacred. And there's another added element or feature that makes places sacred within the Islamic tradition is their role in the end of days, their role in eschatology. So Jerusalem has a lot of traditions dealing with eschatology. That is remarked in the Quranic verses on Jerusalem being the place where the souls stand up during the day of judgment. So that's one example of the traditions on eschatology about the city and its certain holy sites. We find, for example, on the Haram al-Sharif, a gate called the Gate of Mercy. And this Gate of Mercy within the tradition opens up onto the valley that is As-Sahira, which is considered the place where souls will be judged on the day of judgment, Yawm al-Qiyamah. So those different features of a place within the Islamic tradition makes it sacred and sanctified. And Jerusalem, it has so many of those places that are connected to the life of the Prophet, to the early origins of the faith, to biblical figures, and to the end of days themes.
So one of the things you mentioned briefly earlier was the fact that Muslims were discussing whether or not it was okay to visit churches and Christian holy sites. And one of the striking features of the Faḍā'i'l text from the Mamluk period, from 1260, the end of towards the end of the Crusading period, is the inclusion of such Christian holy sites. So why did Muslim authors start to give these places such prominence during the Mamluk period, do you think?
Actually, the inclusion of Christian holy sites appears before the Crusading period, and Faḍā'i'l al-Quds works before the Crusading period. So we see in the works by al-Wasiti and al-Musharraf ibn al-Murajjah that Christian holy sites, such as most importantly the Mount of Olives, the Church of the Ascension or the Dome of the Ascension, Qubbat al-Su'ud, and in addition to, for example, the Tomb of Mary, the Church of Saint Mary, where apparently it is believed that Mother Mary is buried, those churches or those locations are actually sanctified in the al-Quds traditions that are collected in the works before the beginning of the Crusades.
Mm.
Now, within those traditions, you also have certain traditions by some of the early converts sanctifying, for example, the Church of Saint Mary, and at the same time saying that Muslims should not enter those places because the sins multiply as well as good deeds multiply.
Mm.
Now, I've made the argument in my article with the Jerusalem Quarterly is that by saying Muslims should not enter because sins multiply inside this Christian place, as well as good deeds, I argue it is more a caution or a warning that if you enter it, make sure that you behave properly. Make sure that you're solemn and spiritual and pious in your conduct inside this church, because if you commit any sins, they multiply, and if you commit any good deeds, the rewards are multiplied as well.
Mm.
Now, Islamic law did not really come in during the pre-Crusades or Crusading period, but the Islamic law material it was incorporated during the Mamluk period. Here we see Shafi'i authors debating in more detail whether Muslims can enter a church in Jerusalem. And this Islamic law material we find right after the discussion on the sanctity of the Church of Mary, or the Tomb of Mary. So you have presented here the Shafi'i madhab and their law, which is basically states, yes, Muslims can enter a church and pray in Jerusalem, but they give certain requirements. For example, there should be no icons visible on the walls of the church. They should take permission from the priests of the church. Mass should not be taking place at the church during the time when Muslims pray there. And at the same time, finally, if you cannot fulfill any of those conditions, you can just put a certain curtain within the church and pray there as a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
So the Shafi'i law is much more flexible versus the Hanbali law.
Mm.
The Hanbali law, which has been stipulated by Ibn Taymiyyah, states that Muslims should not enter churches.
Mm.
However, in his decree, in his short work on Jerusalem, al-Qa'ida fi Ziyarat Bayt al-Maqdis, the ruling on entering and visiting Jerusalem, he does not write against visiting Jerusalem and doing pilgrimage there. He says it is in Islamic law allowed based on the hadith, but he's against the excesses of Muslims doing there.
Mm-hmm.
So some of those excesses are, for example, entering many churches, having their children baptized by priests. Even though they're Muslim, they take their children not to be baptized, but to be blessed by priests. Pardon me. And he sees other excessive rituals. For example, there's this ritual called at-Ta'rif coming from Arafah and Mount Arafah, Jabal Arafah of the Hajj ritual.
Near Mecca.
So in Mecca, during the Hajj season, Ibn Taymiyyah, and that was documented even before the Crusading period, we find that Muslims from across Palestine and Syria, they actually come to Jerusalem during the Hajj season and perform Hajj similar rituals, like circumambulating the holy rock in the Dome of the Rock, going to the Mount of Olives. So those rituals of Ta'rif were popular in the medieval period, and Ibn Taymiyyah wrote against performing those rituals as in lieu of a Hajj to Mecca. In fact, I found in the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and other chronicles that Ibn Taymiyyah himself did visit and stay in Jerusalem for a while. We're not sure whether he did pilgrimage or not, but it is recorded that he stayed there on his way back to Damascus during his lifetime. So that makes it significant that he's writing against those bid'ah innovations, perhaps out of first-hand experience being in Jerusalem there.
Okay, so I mean, you mentioned a very interesting point there that Ibn Taymiyyah was criticizing Muslims who went to get their children baptized or blessed by priests, which I guess is something which, you know, his criticism of that actually tells us that was happening. So what other aspects about kind of day-to-day, local level Christian-Muslim relations do we see in these texts?
Well, from the Faḍāʻil al-Quds works, we see that a lot of those, several of those Christian holy sites are sanctified. And Muslims are, by its sanctification, are encouraged to visit them because they're associated with the life of Jesus and the life of Mary. But what we see in more detail, for example, in the Chronicles, in the work that is both a chronicle and a Faḍāʻil al-Quds work, the important work of Al-Uns al-Jalil بتاريخ القدس والخليل, the sublime companion to the history of Jerusalem, Hebron, which is written during the end of the 15th century by the chief judge of Jerusalem, Mujir al-Din al-Hanbali. He's a Hanbalite and he was the chief judge of Jerusalem towards the end of the Mamluk period. And in this work, in his Chronicles section, he describes how Muslims actually enter churches, especially the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now, within the Faḍāʻil al-Quds traditions, we have traditions that sanctify certain Christian holy sites, like the Church of the Ascension, the Church of the Tomb of Mary, the Mount of Olives, the Church of Bethlehem. But the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not seen in a very positive light within the Faḍāʻil al-Quds and the Islamic faith, because it hits on the major difference between Islam and Christianity, that within the Christian tradition, Jesus has been crucified, but within the Islamic tradition, he hasn't been crucified. So the Islamic tradition is very strongly and directly is against the sanctity of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And yet we see within the Chronicles of Mujir ad-Din, him writing at the end of the 15th century saying that Muslims actually do enter the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and they've been doing that for centuries. They've been visiting and praying there for centuries, especially during Easter, at the time when you have the Feast of Light that occurs, I think, on Good Friday in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where according to the Christian tradition, there's the miracle of the light coming down to the church, and all the candles are being lit by this miracle. Mujir ad-Din does observe that and says, until today, we see Muslims not only visiting and entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, but they're also participating in this feast, in this event during Easter. And of course, as a Hanbali, he condemns it. And he says this is not according to Islamic law. So from all those reports within the Chronicles of Mujir ad-Din and from the Faḍāʻil al-Quds, you can see that the sharing of sacred spaces seems to be a common daily event that is occurring in Jerusalem and across the Holy Land. How do we also know this? Is because when you look at the travel literature from the Mamluk period, but especially from the Ottoman period, travelers such as Ibn Battuta and Nabulsi that we spoke about, Ibn Khaldun to a certain extent, they write that they visited the Church of St. Mary, that they visited the Mount of Olives. And in the case of Al-Nabulsi, he recites the Faḍāʻil al-Quds works from the Mamluk period on why it's important to visit, why they're sacred, and what he should do. For example, read the verse from the chapter on Maryam, on Mary in the Quran. So the evidence from the travel literature corroborates the evidence from the Faḍāʻil al-Quds traditions that Christian holy sites are not only sanctified and extolled in the Islamic tradition, but they're actually visited by Muslim pilgrims during the medieval and the early modern period.
So in that sense, then, do these texts, from these texts, do we see that Muslims who went to these Christian spaces view them mainly with reverence, or is it something else? Is it curiosity or rivalry or another reason for going there?
Well, based on the text, it's with reverence, because a holy site is a holy site if it's associated with an important episode or an important figure. So the Church of St. Mary is, for example, is sanctified when through traditions on the night journey of Muhammad al-Isra. So Jibreel, the archangel, would tell Muhammad, look to your right and you have the tomb of your sister Mary, and look to your left, you have the tomb of your brother David, referring to the tomb of David in Jerusalem and referring to the tomb of Mary. So you have traditions that sanctify those places. But not only that, in the Faḍāʻil al-Quds, you have specific instructions to what Muslims should do. For example, Muslims at the Church of St. Mary might have to recite the first two verses of the chapter of Mary from the Quran. So they have to approach it with reverence and piety, supplications and prayers, and reading Quranic verses, because that is what is commanded to them by the Faḍāʻil al-Quds and the Islamic tradition. And in fact, the travel literature also writes how, for example, An-Nabulsi, before entering the Church of St. Mary, he read those verses from the Quran, he prayed, he supplicated, etc. And those are what he did follows what is written in the Faḍāʻil al-Quds. Now, the other issue is curiosity, perhaps, or traffic. So we see that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right next to it, we have the Khanqa that was founded by Saladin for the Sufis there. So you can imagine, just from physical proximity, you have Sufis that stay right next to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and walking by there every day. So I argued in one of my articles and in my dissertation that just by the fact that there's traffic of Sufis moving around Christian holy sites will inevitably lead them to enter those places. So we have one of the guides, one of the 12th century guides, Al-Harawi's guide on ziyarah and pilgrimage across the Islamic world. He provides in his guidebook to pilgrimage great details of measurements of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the characteristics on the outside, characteristics on the inside. So that shows you that he entered the place out of curiosity to describe it in his work, for example. So I would say it's a combination of three issues: approaching them with reverence, physical proximity of Sufis and Muslim pilgrims walking around the city and living or praying right next to Christian holy sites, and also curiosity, as we see how some Muslim authors describe those Christian places in great detail.
Okay, so you mentioned there Al-Nabulsi, and your dissertation kind of follows on into the Ottoman period after 1516. So what does this continuation into the Ottoman period suggest about the long-term permeability of sacred boundaries in Jerusalem?
Well, what the early modern Ottoman period, so we're speaking about 1517 to 1798, is quite interesting when it comes to the Faḍāʻil al-Quds. Why? Because the zenith of the production of the Faḍāʻil al-Quds occurs in the Mamluk period, which is right before the Ottoman period. In the Ottoman period, we have about 3 to 5 Faḍāʻil al-Quds works written that are extant, maybe even less. But in place of the Faḍāʻil al-Quds, we have really this remarkable proliferation of travel literature that is specifically about Sufis visiting Jerusalem and the Holy Land and writing their diary, recording their travels and their pilgrimage and visitations to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. What we see here is a continuation of the tradition of Muslim pilgrims visiting Jerusalem and performing pilgrimage there. But not only do we have the continuation of this tradition, but based on the travel literature, we see how the Mamluk period and the texts from the Mamluk period really served as a major resource as pilgrimage guides for those Muslims visiting Jerusalem in the Ottoman period. So we don't have plagiarism of the Faḍāʻil traditions. We actually have authors that specifically cite a work from the Mamluk period and its author and what they say about the different holy sites the travelogue author is visiting and doing rituals there. So you have this continuation of the tradition of Islamic pilgrimage to Jerusalem, combined with the continuation of the transmission of knowledge of the Faḍāʻil al-Quds books into the Ottoman period. But what we also have from the travelogue literature is this record of the proliferation of Sufi circles within Jerusalem. So many of our authors are Sufi, and when they come to Jerusalem, they visit other Sufis that live there or are visiting there. So you see a trove of data and historical records and anecdotes and social and economic and religious information about this other angle of sacredness within Jerusalem, which is the Sufi presence in Jerusalem. And during the Ottoman period, it really proliferates. And there are many examples of Sufis residing there. We have reports, for example, We have reports of al-Nabulsi and others visiting the tomb of Mujir ad-Din and writing about the tomb of Mujir ad-Din. And incidentally, the tomb of Mujir ad-Din is actually right next to the church of St. Mary on the Mount of Olives. It's built nicely with a small dome, and it is frequented by Muslims in the early modern Ottoman period as a somewhat of a sacred place.
Okay, so just final question then, and this is kind of an overview question regarding how the aims of the channel itself. How did the Crusades and the events of the Crusades in general impact Muslim pilgrimage and Faḍā'i'l al-Quds literature? I mean, you mentioned that a little bit at the beginning, but if you could just sum up from about the year 1100 all the way through to the end of the Mamluk period, what was the impact of the Crusades on Faḍā'i'l literature and on Muslim pilgrimage, do you think?
Absolutely. Well, with the crusading period, as we all know, at the end of the First Crusade, the Franks were able to take over Jerusalem, and they were able to rule there for almost 9 centuries. Now, this loss of Jerusalem, which is considered one of the 3 holiest cities in Islam, caused quite a strong alarm within the Islamic world. In terms of the immediate movement to liberate Jerusalem from the Franks did not happen instantaneously, but it happened gradually. And the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds works as ideological tools, they played a strong role. So during the 12th century, we have authors such as the members of the Ibn Asakir family writing those Faḍā'i'l al-Quds books to extol the Muslims, to remind them of the sanctity of Jerusalem within the Islamic consciousness. But there were also ideological tools for the reconquest of Jerusalem. So the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds genre in the 12th century took on an ideological role for the jihad to liberate Jerusalem from the Franks. And that is evident, for example, when the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds were read before the Battle of Hattin and Saladin fighting the Franks there. They were read also after Salah ad-Din liberated Jerusalem in the sermon of Muhyiddin ibn Zaki, when he gave the sermon in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and Salah ad-Din was present, and he read the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds. He read the traditions that make Jerusalem sacred from the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds works. And in the 13th century, in the first half of the 13th century, in order for us to further understand the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds role, we have to understand the fate of Jerusalem during the later Ayyubid period, which I've touched upon earlier. So Jerusalem, for example, there was a strong worry that the Crusaders would re-invade Jerusalem, and that occurred with Frederick II, for example. So at that time, during the later Ayyubid period, Jerusalem had a very precarious position in terms of security, in terms of whether it will stay within a Muslim abode or not. So again, you have the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds being composed by Ibn al-Jawzi, for example, in the first quarter of the 13th century, attacking Al-Kamil. They were read on the Umayyad mosque in Damascus with the purpose of attacking Al-Kamil for giving over Jerusalem to Frederick II. So there, in the crusading period, they are ideological tools. But during the Mamluk period, the impact of the Crusades on the genre during the Mamluk period comes in the fact that the Mamluk rulers wanted to re-sanctify, re-Islamize, and keep and maintain Jerusalem within their sultanate and within the abode of Islam. Hence, their investment of great religious and institutional projects within Jerusalem, which helped accommodate pilgrims, which helped enter that reinforcing cycle I spoke about, that more Muslims came to Jerusalem, more Muslims wrote about the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds during their visits in Jerusalem, and you have the proliferation of the genre during the Mamluk period, which I've argued in my article, in my dissertation, is a direct impact of a long-term impact of the Crusades on Islamic lands, and specifically on Jerusalem and its sanctity in the faith.
Right. So one more way in which the Crusades impacted Islam and Islamic societies in the medieval period. Fadi, thank you very much.
In fact, if I can add that what we see in the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds from the Mamluk period is that we have extensive reports on the reign and career of Salah ad-Din. The memory of Salah ad-Din and his battles and campaigns against the Crusaders and his reign more generally were actually incorporated in the Faḍā'i'l al-Quds works during the Mamluk period. So we see the sections on the history of Jerusalem being longer in the Mamluk era, because they are memorializing the age of Salah ad-Din in a way to preserve the memory of the loss of Jerusalem to the Franks, and to basically re-emphasize and restate the importance of Jerusalem and Islam, and that they have to hold on to it. So that we see the impact of the Crusades on the genre by the fact that the genre includes the chronicles on the life and career of Salah ad-Din and the later Ayyubids as well.
Great. So Fadi Ragheb, thank you very much indeed for joining me today to discuss your thesis.
Thank you, Alex. It's my pleasure, as always.
And my thanks to Dr. Ragheb for taking the time to discuss with us Mamluk and Crusading period Faḍā'i'l al-Quds literature. If you've enjoyed this and want to know more, please click the link in the description box below to Dr. Ragheb's PhD thesis. And if you've enjoyed these videos, please do consider commenting, liking, or subscribing. I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another one. Please do join me then if you can.